So, I've called this Fireproof. This is, I'll say why I've intentionally named this and why this naming of this particular sermon is not actually accurate. And so I'll hold that to the end and hopefully it will make sense. So we're on Daniel 3, 16 to 30. And we're on, looking at how Daniel's friends, most certainly, are now put in the oven, as it were, or the kiln. But we'll see that as well, what it looks like. Last week we looked at the first part, chapter 3. And last week we needed to understand what it was to not give into the pressure from the world, to conform to its ways, not to trade our soul for worldliness and reject Jesus. And this week I think we need to understand how it is possible to be sure of your salvation, that we develop a character and mindset that is otherworldly, that is not focused, not rooted in this world, but we want to see the kingdom. And so how do we keep our focus on the kingdom of heaven, but also live in this world today? Very difficult challenge with everything that we all each go through. In the face of this pressure to conform to the world, how do we confidently stand on God's promise of salvation, despite the consequences of being a follower in Jesus and the cost that comes with that? So I want to share two things with you today in particular, which is submission and assurance. And I think in these verses we'll see, I think will be helpful to understand how that works and how they're a crucial part of the Christian life. So I want to show that through submitting our lives to Jesus, through the assurance that he promises life everlasting and being restored in the sight of God, we can live this other life, this better life, in real life. We can live that life today and know that Jesus is Lord. We spoke of not being worldly last week, so I think we answered the question this week: if not of the world, then what am I? If I'm not this thing that the world tells me I am, then what am I if I give my life to Christ? So hopefully we'll answer that question as well today. So let's jump into the first set of verses, Daniel 3, 15 to 18. It says, "Now when you hear the sound of the horn," I'm just going back one, by the way, just so we get context. The flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music. If you're ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you'll be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Remember, that's the king Nebuchadnezzar saying this to Daniel's friends. 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter." How amazingly bold. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. I love the respect still in there, even though they're saying it's not going to happen. Verse 18, "But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." So, let's just get an idea of what's happening. King Nebuchadnezzar said to these three men, "Who is the God who will save you from the punishment of my hands?" And this was because Daniel's three friends would not bow down to the golden image that the king had created, and ordered everyone to bow down when this music started playing. And I want us to understand this first part carefully, as these men stand not only on their faith in God, but also make no defense for doing so. That even they trust entirely in the defense of God rather than justifying themselves in their actions. I've told some of you of my story, maybe some of you haven't heard, but my experience of going out on one night as an observer of the work of the street pastors. And these are people that do amazing work. They give support and assistance to young people, whoever they are, older people, whoever people they are, certainly in times when they had too much to drink, and all those things, and just having their life is kind of turned upside down. So they become this listening ear to those who are experiencing the nightlife on Friday and Saturday nights mainly. and they do provide this valuable service. But when I was on one of these patrols, we came to these two people sitting outside what is now Pizza Express in Bexley Heath on the step. And this was, they'd drunk a lot and they were just sitting there. And after chatting to them and explaining who we were, I mean, they were explaining who they were, I was kind of just observing. They asked us if we thought Genesis was real. Do you really think this stuff is real? This Genesis stuff where God creates the earth, the universe, you think it's real? And to be fair, back then, I was still very much naive Christian. Not to say I'm not a naive Christian now, it's just the whole life thing of being naive, but very much naive. But when I heard that, I was still not so naive that I thought this is going to be great. They're going to explain and stand on the word that Genesis is, however you believe it, if it's thousands of years or days as it says, however, that the fundamental thing as Christians is that God created the universe. That's what's important, that God created the universe. And so I thought, well, at least this is going to be a really interesting conversation. The response, however, was unexpected and saddened me quite a lot. One of the street pastors responded with, maybe to paraphrase, it was quite some years ago, it's just a metaphor. It's not really real. It's not a real account of what God did. God didn't create the universe. It's just something someone came up with in their mind. Just a poetic way of describing how the universe began. And I need to stress, I think the work they do is important to the community. It's so very important alongside the emergency services. They bring calm in quite frantic situations, peace in these tense times. But the reason I bring this up in regards to the verses here is because I found myself asking in this moment with the street pastors, if the Bible becomes anything we want it to be, then what makes you different from social workers or the emergency services? Because then it becomes just about a social service. It becomes about something, you're just going out helping people, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you're making a claim about the very work you do. Street pastors, you're making a stand on the word and saying, not only are we here to help you and to kind of maybe help you in the troubled time you have, we want to guide you, lead you to something where your life doesn't have to be like this. You can live a new life in Jesus. You can choose him over this life you're currently living. See, most people with a purpose to help their community can do good things for their community. But for the Christian, it is not just about that. As Christians, we can enjoy the company of others, of anybody. Enjoy being around family and friends, even if they don't believe in Jesus themselves. And many times the subject of God may not come up, even in those times that we gather together. But when it does, what are we going to say? See, because when I hear those words, when someone asks me for the first time, and I might have known them for such a long time, and they're not believers, that one moment they suddenly ask about God, and I don't have an answer, I get very worried about where I am. I think, I'm not prepared for this. I'm not armed and ready with the word of God to tell them the thing that they need to have a new life. And that's worrying, isn't it? If we're not ready and armed with the word of God, if we're not understanding who this God is, and someone out of the blue one day suddenly says, do you think all of this stuff is really real? I mean, the answer has to be yes. But then there's a why, isn't there? And so I think I was quite naive to begin with. Most certainly, I think every Christian is naive when they first become a Christian. because you're learning about God. You're trying to learn who he is and what his word is all about. Why has he written this book? But you've made a commitment to Jesus. And so we should know the God that we're believing in. We should know the God that we're putting all our trust and our faith in. What are we going to say when that question comes up? For Daniel's friends, as we look at these verses, they were not looking to make their faith in God and knowledge of God become something that moulded into the pattern of worldly belief. They weren't going to sort of half compromise on it and say, well, I can still basically justify to myself that I'll bow down to this golden image. But in my heart, as I'm bowing down, I'm going to say, but I'm still a Christian. I'm still a believer in God. But yet worshipping a false idol. They weren't going to do that. They said, no, this is too far. This is enough. We're not going to go any further than this. That is a direct, as rightly so, violation of their belief to have worshipped another idol, a different God, as the text says. So yeah, they could have just justified themselves, bound down to this idol, and then justified it by saying, well, don't worry, we're still followers of God. We'll just ignore that one and carry on. But how would have that been compatible with the mandate from the Bible that we must live out our faith in a practical way? I believe in God in my heart, but I don't want that to ruin someone else's day by actually standing on it when called to do so. What's the common thing that non-Christians say that I've heard many times? I'm glad you've got a faith, but keep it to yourself. You should just keep it to yourself. Don't tell anyone about it. Don't bother me with your belief. Daniel's friends, in not only choosing to not bow down, did not think it necessary to defend their actions either. They simply said, no, do what you like to us, but no. But there is a point we're going to have to not be so observant about spoiling someone's day. Inevitably, my experience is that certainly for people who are very resistant to accepting that God exists, that Jesus Christ is Lord, one of the things that they hate is being told that Jesus exists, that he is living, that he is God. And they respond with that, I don't want to know. I'm glad you're happy, but I don't want to know. But we're going to have to ruin many people's days by saying, I need to tell you, not because I've got some religious checklist to go through. I'm telling you because I believe in it so much, and I know at the very least that believing in this gives you a whole new life in Jesus. I want you to know that. Because this is great news. This is good news. So we do have to say at some point no to the cultural opinion, to the cultural dislike of sharing Jesus. We are in a bizarre world today, and I imagine that even before I was born, the world was still bizarre, and before any of you were born, the world was still bizarre before that. But of course, it's from our own personal perspectives, isn't it, when we live in the actual time of the world. But I remember when Cameron was a child, and of course, we want him to enjoy his childhood. But when it came to crossing the line, challenging authority, testing the boundaries, as it's said, he needed to know that was not acceptable. He needed to be told, no, you're not going to do that. And I think we find ourselves today, and I don't blanket this with every single parent around the world or whatever, but in popular culture, there seems to be a trend at least that we find this world that we live in that we shouldn't say no to your kid. You shouldn't say no to your child because it has a negative impact. It's a negative word. And so people say, don't do that because it will harm them. It will hurt them. What do they say instead? And this just blows my mind. Here's maybe 2-3-year-old, let's say. They said, don't say no to them. Reason with them. Have you tried to reason with a 2 or 3-year-old? I'm going to give you a news flash. They can't reason. They have no way of reasoning. They just have no boundaries because they don't know the world yet. They don't know the world fully enough to know the etiquette, the way you should behave socially and treat people nicely. But I've never met a 2 or 3-year-old that was ever willing to sit down and have a long conversation about why they did something and let's go through that and let's do a psychological assessment about how unwell you might be and how we can help. When a child crosses the line, does something wrong on purpose, knowingly and in rebellion, it says gently persuade them through conversing, understanding and reason. In essence, be their friend. Someone in this church many years ago said, parents are not your friends. They are your parents. There's a massive difference between being a friend of a child and being a parent of a child. And today we find nothing but people going onto talent shows, saying the same thing over and over again. They say, why have you come on this show? I want my son or daughter to be proud of me. It is not a parent's responsibility, and anyone can disagree with this, to appeal to your child that they have to be proud of you in order that you earn their trust, and then you can start talking to them. What's happening with this approach? And I don't want to stress, it's not everybody. I'm not blanking this over the whole world. It seems to be in particular pockets, but it is spreading, I think, into general life. People don't want the difficult job, I think, of sometimes being the bad guy. Having to be the parent who is still loving and cares for this child, and yet sometimes will have to be the bad guy. And that's still love, by the way. They will have to say, no, you cannot do that. No, it is wrong. This is wrong. This is right. This is good. This is bad. But raising children to respect parents, children have to be raised to respect others, be a good citizen in society, which involves having to say no to your children. And it is sad that many have opted to take this position of being friends. And I was thinking about this this morning, I sort of get it. I think what's happening is that you kind of want your child to still be young. At the same time, you're getting older and you want a mate. You want a friend. You want a buddy. And I've seen this even many years ago, that at a certain point, parent and child, as it were, child but older, would go out together in the evening. I mean, to the point where they behave the same. I'm not saying that's wrong. There's nothing wrong with going out with your son or daughter. But they would almost become like one thing. The age would drop of the parent, the maturity of the parent would drop, and then match the child. And I've seen that often. It not really bothered me before, wasn't a Christian, didn't really understand. Teach a child in the ways they should know. It's an important aspect of certainly being a Christian and bringing up your child. Doesn't mean a guarantee that your child will become a Christian, by the way. Many have fallen at that hurdle because it's down to them to decide. But we are in this very bizarre time where we don't want to say no. But all this to say that I think the principle is the same. If you stand for something, especially as a Christian, then you have to stand. And it's difficult sometimes to do that. And yes, the parenting is difficult to have to guide them back on. It means you have to be the person who they may not like for a day or two. But in the same way, being a Christian, when you stand for something, certainly when you stand for your faith, people are not going to like what you're saying because doesn't conform to what they do. It doesn't conform to how they live. So even if that means saying no to something, compromises that which you profess to believe in. And this is really something I've mentioned before. Really good example of Daniel's friends here of saying we're not even going to small things, compromises. Because those are the things that slowly start to undo your faith. They slowly start to deconstruct your faith. You say, well, this is all right to do. And that's all right. It's only small things. But they're very harmful things because they don't seem like they are, but they eventually start to unwind all of that faith that you've kind of learned and built up in God. They can slowly unpick it. So Daniel's friends are not even letting in that. They're going to say no. Not even letting in the draft under the door. It's not going to happen. We're going to block it out completely. But of course, then Daniel's friends goes further. 17 and 18 says, if we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your God or worship the image of gold you have set up. The key thing here, even if God does not deliver us, even if, we will still not worship your gods. This is a submission to God it requires faith, it requires trust in God, but it requires that we submit ourselves to God, whatever the consequences, whatever God will do with that. It is not that we should be selling this thing, that if you do something for God and you say, God will do this, that God will do it. That's not what we're here for. If we're trusting a holy, perfect God who is in charge of everything, as I've said over these last few weeks, whatever the outcome of that is, are we ready to trust him in it? They knew that God was fully capable of delivering them from this fiery furnace, but they did not assume to know the will of God. And it go, no, he will. That's it. It's going to happen. Submission in the Christian faith is the principle that our belief in God is not driven by what I want God to do. Submission is about being willing to leave our lives in God's hands, regardless of what that means for me. And there's a really good reason for this, other than this particular situation. We all struggle with a lot of things in our life where we're trying to align ourselves with God, but we're struggling to get there. Now, if you're not open to God teaching you and helping you, we're never going to get there. We're never going to learn. We're never going to get to this point where we're dealing and getting through stuff and God's helping us with it, if we're going to say, I'm only going to accept the answer that works for me. Daniel's friends said, we'll accept the answer that works for God, whatever that answer is. When we look to God the Son, Jesus, who submitted to God the Father's will and died for the sins of mankind so we can be rescued from certain death and eternity in hell, then how can we not submit to him, irrespective of the consequences we might face from the world? John 5 verse 19 says, Jesus gave them this answer, I tell you the truth, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can do only what he sees the Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son also does. John 5 verse 30 says, by myself I can do nothing. I judge only as I hear. My judgment is just, for I seek not to please myself, but him who sent me. Jesus talks about this relationship later on of being one in the Father as we are one in Jesus. It's the same principle. Are we going to do things for us, or are we going to do things for Jesus Christ? If Jesus Christ is doing it for the one who sent him, the Father, then we do everything for the one who's been sent. It's the only way we can learn about submission. Jesus loves his Father and willingly does the Father's will, not to please himself, but his Father, the one who sent him. For Daniel's friends, this would cause bitterness and anger in the king. He would get mad. How dare anyone stand on any morality, any other belief, other than the one the king has ordained to be moral and worthy in his eyes? And so it continues. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. It is thought that the furnace described here was a kiln furnace, something like that. Entrance you can't see at the top, but effectively what would happen is they would build the fire in the bottom, in the door and the doorway. Effectively, they would have been taken up to the top, and then the fire would have been blazing. The heat would have been pumping out of the top, and then they would have really, if it was a normal furnace, the soldiers would have been fine, and they would have just pushed them in. And so it's kind of a picture. There's many different types, but it's probably about as close as probably we can get to understanding it. The maximum temperature of these furnaces could have reached anywhere between 1260 to 1480 Celsius. Even in those times. And not to get too morbid on you, but the human body incinerates from about 800 Celsius upwards. So there's no chance of saying, well, they might have, been hurt themselves. They might have. It's way above that temperature. But what is described in great detail in our verses is quite important, because what is about to happen is no magic trick. It's no illusion. We're told that the strongest soldiers tied Daniel's friends, tied them up and threw them, or at least got to almost throw them into the blaze. But so hot was the fire that the soldiers throwing them into it, not even the fire itself, killed the soldiers before they got to the fire. Now, try and just picture this for a moment. They're taking these prisoners up to the top where the fire is, or the pit at least, they're going to throw them into. And I would imagine that the soldiers are not going first because it's quite hot. I imagine they're pushing them toward the fire. Now, Daniel's friends, that being said, are all at the front, and the soldiers are pushing them up towards the top. Daniel's friends don't die, even before they get to the fire. But the soldiers who are taking them up there all die. They all get killed. That's a miracle that's I think is overlooked because we get to the furnace bit, we're going, oh, look, they're all in the fire. Even before they get there, all these soldiers die. Just remember what these men were wearing. Goes into detail for a reason. They were in turbans, clothes, coats, covers, all sorts on them. This is fuel for a fire. Clothes, in general, ignite at 200 Celsius without a naked flame. And they're standing at the top of this thing, even at the lowest heat of 1260 Celsius. But the clothes on Daniel's friends were not touched, we'll find out. Not even at this point. They didn't even ignite. There was no burning on the edges of the clothes. There was nothing. And yet they're like a fuel pod being taken up to a fire. It won't take long for this thing to explode, for these people to be burned up. Not even the ropes at that point had even ignited. So then we get to the part that everyone looks at. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego came out of the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. I mean, that's an eyewitness account, right? It may not be Daniel writing this, I don't know, but it's certainly someone writing it, and it's a very detailed account of what went on here. We find a really helpful pointer, though, to this later on in the New Testament of how the king is able to see them, how he's able to see them through the fire, that they're actually able to stand in the flames of the fire. It's in Hebrews 11, verse 33-34 says, "Who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions," we'll get to that, "quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies." The fire was not extinguished. It was made ineffective. When it says about the fire being quenched, in this context, it does mean to be ineffective. It doesn't mean that the fire was put out. The heat and the effectiveness was nullified, so they could stand in the flames. But then we get to the point that's argued about among people who are into a lot of this stuff. The king then sees a 4th person and says, "He is like a son of God," or at least that's what the NIV says. There are other translations, and I'll get into that, of what he says. And he says that here in verse 25. He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Now, we need to understand that the king would have likely had no knowledge of Jesus here. He didn't seem to have knowledge of Hebrew prophecy. So what is he seeing? What does he see? Now, even looking to the original text, it actually uses the word Elohim and is translated as the Son of God. So many other translations will say Son of God, not sons of God. And there are occasions in the Old Testament where Jesus is described as an angel of the Lord. So there are appearances of what we would say is Jesus. He would appear as not in a physical form, but as a maybe as an angel we might understand it. He would appear in some form, but not physical. And he makes appearances at specific moments in the Old Testament history. And we would call this a pre-incarnate Jesus. So he would appear as something you can see, but not necessarily maybe something you can't touch unless he allows that. So it's not the full incarnate Jesus that we hear about in the New Testament, in the Gospels. But he does appear, and we do acknowledge that Jesus does appear in the Old Testament. But it also, as many people acknowledge, could just be an angel from God. Could just be an angel also. And while it's an important thing to talk about, an important event, there's clearly a need for the king to see this himself. And that's what we're focusing on here. It's that the king sees it. The king is seeing something. We can say that Jesus was there with the men, but clearly that was for the purpose of King Nebuchadnezzar witnessing that it was not men that were defying the fire. He needed to see that, because we'll get to chapter 4 and you'll see why he needs to see that. He needs to see that God was with them, with these three men, in some form or another, protecting them from the fire's effects. And I want to say here that here is how we understand assurance in Christ as we look at this particular part. And why it's not only important to Christians, but to those around us as well who don't believe. For Daniel's friends, they were not hesitant before the furnace. They didn't seek some other confirmation before they told the king they would not obey his command. They said, "We know that our God will deliver us, either here or to be back with him, even if that means no longer here." And they submitted to their faith in God. They said, "Whatever God wills." But the reason they could do that, the reason why they were so confident, is that God gave them assurance of them being his people. They knew that they were God's people. They knew that they were chosen. That means to be one of God's people, it's to also inherit the promises of that classification. If you are a believer in Jesus, you have now a classification that you now inherit all the promises of God, whether now or the future promises of when we go to meet him. Romans 8 verses 38 to 39 says, "For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord." This is the attitude of those three men. You can burn this body, you can kill us, but it will never separate us from our God. You're not going to, just because you kill this, we're still going to be with him. We're going to be with him for eternity, and you're going to hate that. You see, with this assurance in them also, they were not concerned with things that might end their earthly life. Because in either outcome, they were going to be delivered, whether that be from death or in life. Psalm 23, verse 4, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me." But what does that mean for the king who witnessed it? He sees them come out of the fire unaffected, with only the rope that tied them burned up in the fire. He says this, 28 to 13, "And Nebuchadnezzar said, 'Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against God of Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way.' Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego in the province of Babylon." You know, when you read something, you think, Yes, he's getting it. And he says, if you challenge this God, I'm going to cut you to pieces. He hasn't got it. So close and yet so far. But their assurance in God and their submission to God, practicing in the world that just how much they were assured by the power of God, recognize exactly what the men were doing. The king says about their God, about their faith in their God, you trusted him and defied me. You were willing to give up your lives rather than worship any God that I ordered you to worship. And I think what the king witnessed is what we find in Romans 12, verse 1. Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Now, let me say this. I'm not telling you, as a Christian, you're going to need to find the nearest furnace, throw yourself in there, because that's what it literally means. You're going to have to go and burn yourself up. That's not what this is saying at all. It is what you do in your heart. It's how you perceive God, how you see God through the Bible, and that you want to live for him. It's a living sacrifice. This is great. Not a death sacrifice, a living sacrifice. Your life that you have in the world, you're going to sacrifice that and give your life to Jesus instead. That's what it's asking. That's what Jesus is asking us. But we notice, just as the king was getting close to this moment of understanding that it's all about this one God, he still says, the God of. The God of. Not my God, the God of. And as I mentioned at the start, we do have this today, don't we? Some will say, I don't believe in your God, but I envy, I admire that you have a faith in a God. They would probably say the same thing if we're still using the same sort of language. Good for you and your God. But it is vital that we don't just cherry pick the good works here out of the Bible. See, something else is happening as they're living out this faith. They're trying to show the king that there is a high and mighty God, powerful, worthy of praise, worthy of giving his life to. And this needs to be above all the other things that we do. And we can go through and pick out all the good works we can do. We can help the poor. We can love someone. But we can also do that to the point where we say that's the only thing we do. But we only go out and help people. We only go out and give them some support and help. And there's a problem with that because it makes us think we're sort of making the world a better place. But without Jesus, it kind of doesn't matter. There's no end to this. There's no end to this suffering of this person that we'll meet unless there's a goal at the end. There's a meaning to it. I'll help you for now, but then I'm off. I hope you're okay, but I'm leaving. You know, that's great for that period, and all those things I don't put down as good stuff to do to help people who are down, who are poor, who are impoverished. But that stuff has to lead somewhere. The reason why the world is in a broken state, it is because we defy God as human beings. We submit to our own will, our own wants, our needs, and we reject God. But even as believers encountering people who do not believe, it's not that people will simply notice something different about you. And I've said this in the past, by the way. There is a good principle to say that people notice something different about you as a Christian. But I think it's more than that. It has to be more than that. Once you believe in Jesus, is that there is a difference to some degree. Certainly not of, still trying to not sin and trying to continue to honour God, of course, and not trying to do things that are terrible and heinous, of course. We all struggle with that, whether you're a Christian or not. But once we put our faith in Jesus, we are becoming a different person. And that's important, because how can we preach or share the gospel to those around us if we're not almost away from them to some degree, objective and going, it's about God, it's not about how necessarily I can help you in a practical sense, but I need you to know Jesus. So I do say, yes, of course, we're all in the same boat, but when you believe in Jesus, your life is changed and being changed. And people need to know that. People need to hear about that. They need to know your testimony. They need to know your life story. They need to hear what trials you've been through, the pain that you've had. How can you trust in this God despite or even because of the pain that you've gone through? People need to hear that because they can't connect the two up. And that only comes when you have a clear idea, to some degree at least, why you believe in Jesus. He's my rescue. He's my comforter. He's the one I go to for everything. I can't tell you why everything happens in the world and why terrible things happen all the time. I can tell you this, though. I know that if I keep trusting Jesus in the same way that he came for the first time for my sin, he is coming back again. And I want you to know before that's too late. I want you to know Jesus before it's too late. We are different, becoming different to those around us. It's not because of us, but because we put our trust in what we believe. Even if that sounds ridiculous and stupid to others. Even if they call God all sorts of names in front of you. It's our conviction in what we believe and that we express that conviction that makes the impact. And that's what comes through when you give your life to Jesus. I think what genuinely comes through, and you can stumble over your words and all sorts, but it's conviction that matters. The words that you're saying, the thing that you're telling someone who God is, what he's about, however that might come out even jumbled and messed up, do you have conviction behind it? You may not be very good with words. You may not be very good at evangelizing. It doesn't matter. It's your conviction that you utterly, completely believe in Jesus Christ. I think the messiness of our evangelism, I think, is good. I really do. I think it's really important that we don't get so professional about our evangelism. We still need to connect with one another. We still need to connect with people. And it matters that we're still honest people, open people saying, I believe in Jesus and I'm working my way through life and I stumble and I fall and I mess up. But you know this Jesus, he loves me. Gives his life for me. So I'm going to try at least to honour what he's done for me. Only those who are ready to submit their whole lives to Christ, trusting him, no matter the consequences, can be assured of their salvation. Romans 14, verse 7 to 9, for none of us lives to himself alone, and none of us dies to himself alone. If we live to the Lord. If we die to the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. For this very reason, Christ died and returned to life so that he might be the Lord of both the dead and the living. I said at the start that I think I intentionally mistitled this sermon. And I start with Fireproof because these guys go into this furnace and they seem to be fireproof. And then I thought, I'm not going to change it. There's something wrong with the title, but I'm not going to change it. We're not fireproof. We're not. The problem with that title is it may misguide somebody into thinking that if you just believe in the promises of God, you can do anything. And by the way, I've seen silly people, and I will call them silly people, who have read the Bible, parts of the Bible, very particular verses that say if you get bitten by a snake, you won't get poisoned and you won't die. And have then made a YouTube video to try and prove that point, and literally got bitten by a snake. Now, I know one guy that did it, and he got rushed to hospital because he nearly died. This is insane, isn't it? We're not fireproof. We're not ourselves people that can just shrug off troubles and pain and fear. But it's said that these four free men in the fire were actually dancing. It said they were dancing in the fire. They weren't, it was all about God. It was about God, not about them. They weren't worried about how they could be fireproof. It was that Jesus was providing that protection from them. The fire was still there. The world is still raging around them. But God is protecting them all the time. And that's the one that gives us our protection. I'm going to pray, and then we'll have some worship time together.